Hello once again from the Prim Reaper. Way back when, I was blisteringly angry at the American Psychological Association for putting out its embarrassingly egregious guidelines for men and boys. I am sorry to say that they have continued their woke downward spiral by now putting out an article that talks about how every institution in America is born from the blood of white supremacist ideology and capitalism. And I'm just sitting here with my head in my hands wondering how much more I can take the mental strain of having joined a profession wanting to help others that is now being guided by an association so mired in ideology that any sane person has grown to distrust the motives of the entire field. I mean it. This causes me a great deal of distress. I'm going to explain a little bit about why that is, but I understand if you're not interested in that bit and just want to skip ahead to me tearing into this article a little bit. So if you're more interested in that part, I'll give you a link in the low bar that you can jump ahead to for that. So first, I want to put it out there that the least important reason I'm feeling so upset about all this is because of job security. So don't think that my main concern here is a selfish one. My primary concern is about the clients. For so many reasons, it's difficult for me to figure out the best order to explain it. First, psychologists are people who are supposed to be trained in the workings of the mind. They're meant to understand people's problems, to help people see their concerns differently, to help them process and work through the way they deal with things. Most of the time, people who come to see a counselor aren't doing so because they feel perfectly mentally healthy and stable. Would kind of defeat the purpose. No, people are generally coming because they're in a vulnerable state and want help. In that regard, psychologists have a lot of power and they have a duty to do what is best for their clients. I left my program feeling like there wasn't really a strong theoretical backing behind what I'd learned. Everything I'd worked with, I had to research separately or learn through my practicum placement rather than my actual courses. As bad as that may sound, I think that could be considered the best case scenario with the way things are going, that psychologists simply aren't being given a solid theoretical ground to work with, and that they have to do continued education courses to fill in the gaps. The worst case scenario, on the other hand, is that psychologists are not only not trained in strong psychological theory backed by relevant scientific research, as much as can be had in a social science. Let's be real here, there are a lot of variables to work with in a field like this. That's one of the reasons why studies are so difficult to replicate. Rather, they're being trained in an ideological framework. What are some of the problems with this? Well, one thing I was trained in my practicum to be on the lookout for were my personal biases that I held, so that I could be aware of how they may influence my work with clients. I deeply respected my supervisor's way of doing things and felt she was very careful to watch out for that sort of thing, and in that way I feel very fortunate. But in these new courses, it's like they are literally building bias into the programs. It's no longer a thing to watch out for, it's a feature of the field. I mean, let's look at this article I briefly alluded to before. Let's pick a few choice phrases. Every institution in America is born from the blood of white supremacist ideology and capitalism, and that's the disease. Among those working to end racial injustice, a source of both hope and frustration is the strong body of research that psychologists have built on racial bias, discrimination, and intergroup relations. We have the science already, but nobody knows about it, says Bravada Garrett Akinsanya, PhD, a clinical psychologist based in Minneapolis. And we're not using it to change the culture around us. It's important for APA to be an example of how an organization can look at itself internally, said organizational psychologist Catherine Learmonth, PsyD, during the virtual town hall. That should involve discussions among members about white privilege and white fragility, she said, referring to the discomfort many white people feel when discussing race and racism. Is a person trained in messages like these going to be able to treat the people they see in an unbiased manner? Sure, the rational, level-headed people with the good sense to see the flaws in this mode of thinking may challenge it, assuming, of course, that they don't just leave the field entirely, but those who don't think about it too much will absolutely begin to look at people through this lens. I fail to see how anyone who reads about the need to challenge white privilege, male privilege, and white fragility is going to be able to conduct themselves in an unbiased manner when faced with a white male client facing crippling depression. I'm obviously not opposed to learning about different cultural perspectives and ways of being. On the contrary, I think it is important to being able to work effectively with as many people as possible. But it's not presented in that way at all. You've seen my previous videos covering the material from the courses, and you see it here in this article. It's always this one against the other. One has all the power and the others have none. Divisive crap that just doesn't reflect reality. Unfortunately, though, you stay marinated in it for a long enough time without people around you challenging it, and you can fall victim to thinking it is reality. Not only that, now that ideology has thoroughly permeated the field, future research that is conducted is almost certainly doomed to perpetuate it, especially with many courses requiring that you use research conducted within the past 5 to 10 years. Most of the research that is being published is stuff that assumes exactly this kind of thing. This makes it harder to find research that challenges it by virtue of it aging out of relevance or being buried under a mountain of ideological gobbledygook. I've talked about a lot of this stuff in the past, but I think it's just all coming to a head for me now. I've written a paper for my final course that I would like to try to get published. The subject is on addressing the needs of male victims of domestic violence, but I almost fear that it is a pointless endeavor because I do criticize feminist theory in it. I've seen other papers that have done the same, but I still feel worried that I might just be sending paper to the figurative shredder, as it were. Also, now that I'm out of my program, I feel loath to try to break further into the field now that I see what is happening. I mean, don't get me wrong, I want to, and I eventually will when things settle down a bit, but I'm so hesitant seeing all this kind of nonsense coming out, and I don't want anyone to mistake me for sharing any of these absurd, divisive beliefs just by virtue of belonging to the same profession. While I was in the program, I felt like I at least had the power to stand up for my beliefs and to have my classmates see that there were people who disagreed with it. But now that I'm finished, I really don't know how to get it out there that there is another way. Certainly not without having a bunch of people bashing my eventual practice door down, calling for my head on a pike because I'm a misogynistic white male supremacist, blah blah blah. Maybe I'll organize my own professional college. We can call it something other than psychology or counseling. The College for Mental Wellness and Scientific Study. The College for the Pursuit of Mental Health. The College for the Sane and Rational. I'll create a private practice and call myself not a psychologist, but a practitioner of the mind or something cool like that distinguishes myself from all of those nonsense views. Speaking of nonsense, though, I don't want to just get through this video sounding like a whiner for personal reasons without actually taking the time to seriously critique some of what I'm seeing in this article. Though, let's be honest, I'm pretty sure I'm only going to get through the first paragraph with the amount of garbage in it. This is not the first time I have seen someone refer to the racism pandemic, which, in the middle of an actual pandemic, feels quite honestly a little... I don't even know exactly what to call it. Insensitive, tone deaf, yet again co-opting of another strong word used to refer to something else. People's lives have been shut down over COVID, and a lot of economies have been heavily negatively impacted as well. It's not that people's lives haven't obviously been negatively impacted by racism, but calling it a quote-unquote pandemic, even though it is a human condition that has existed ever since humans as a species developed different levels of melanin dependent on their level of access to sunlight, just seems eye-rolly somehow. You know, as if it is a thing that has gotten worse rather than a thing that has been getting better and is being given more and more attention and concern over the past several decades. Let me tell you, having been in my counseling program and seeing the dedication to discussing the importance of respect and care towards racial and cultural differences and how these impact best practices in the field, and being absolutely aware of how this kind of concern is similarly reflected across other school programs, university and otherwise, and also being absolutely aware of how many businesses are signaling their commitment to anti-racism and even instituting mandatory training for their staff to also prove their commitment to anti-racism, and how comments even hinting at a hint of racism against people of color, not against Caucasian people, but I digress, is enough to have a person lose their job, status, and forever become effectively unemployable again. Well, it seems to me that we're working pretty diggity darn hard to ensure that we are treating everyone equally. Anyone who would look at all of the things I just mentioned and try to claim that we are in a pandemic of racism compared to, say, the Jim Crow era when literal lynchings were relatively commonplace, or in early Canadian years during the many injustices that happened with Indigenous tribes, or even as little as 24 years ago in Canadian history when the last residential school was finally shut down, well, I would challenge that idea just a little bit. I think it does us all a disservice to state that we are in a pandemic of racism despite all of our efforts to challenge racism. First of all, I think it is detrimental to the mental and emotional well-being of people of non-majority cultures to make them believe that they live in a culture that is racist against them, when I think that the absolute majority of people are, if not wholly accepting and even appreciative of their contributions to society, then at very least indifferent to their existence and their differences from our culture. Again, I'm not going to act like racism is not a thing and that there are not people who are negatively disposed to people that are different from them or come from different backgrounds, but to claim that this viewpoint is characteristic of our society rather than a fringe, ill-respected, and even despised minority of people is just not reflective of reality. Second, I think that by stating we are still a culture steeped in racism regardless of everything we are doing to prove otherwise, I believe that initially positively intentioned people will begin to feel hopeless, disenfranchised, ineffective, and with enough time, alienated, embittered, and like there is nothing that they can do to sufficiently satisfy the conditions that would finally allow them to shed the ugly coat of racism they've been told they carry. If you tell a person they are racist because of conditions inherent to them rather than because of anything they can meaningfully change, then you eliminate any motivation to change anything. Worse, you validate those people who actually do hold racist viewpoints, and you give them the power to offer reasons to others for their racism. Let's move on to the next point I want to criticize. That comment about every institution being born from the blood of white supremacist ideology and capitalism. Good gravy of all the loaded statements to make. That one is the real baked potato. Let's start with the first supposition, the white supremacy. Rather than dismiss this idea outright based on everything I've already said, let's be generous and grant them some serious consideration. After all, we absolutely can provide some examples throughout history where white supremacy obviously existed and influenced major decisions. I'm not even talking about obvious things like slavery or colonization, but in more subtle ways like the development of educational theories about the superiority of intellect of some races over others, which, incidentally, often did not place white people at the top of the hierarchy, but that's neither here nor there. Or, like I've talked about before, some places of employment being more likely to hire a white-sounding name over a black-sounding name. I think that because we can find many legitimate examples like these, those who view the world through the lens of intersectionality and critical theory are all too willing to act like these points are the lifeblood of our society, rather than a few unfortunate examples where racial bias can have a terrible influence on the behavior of some, certainly not all, individuals. Look at the situation with the police right now. We have legitimate examples of police engaging in racially discriminatory behaviors, and rather than focus on the actions of these people in particular, we have calls for defunding the police and, even worse, calls for violence against the police, even those who are people of color themselves. Something isn't quite following here. I think, also, that some people have gotten so comfortable with throwing around the phrase white supremacy that they have forgotten what it really means, or forgotten what real examples of white supremacy look like. White supremacy involves the belief that white people are inherently a superior race to others. In my view, this is a very specific belief that comes with a very specific set of actions. For example, someone who believes that different races of people have different strengths and abilities than others is not necessarily a white supremacist if they do not believe that white people are superior to all others. Someone who says that America is for whites and that all other races need to go home is a good example of a white supremacist. Someone who throws a resume in the trash because they are awkward and afraid of mispronouncing someone's name over the phone is not necessarily a white supremacist. Someone who throws a resume in the trash because they see a black-sounding name and automatically assume that the next person named John Smith will automatically be better at the job, now that's another story. I think, like many terms these days, the umbrella of white supremacy is growing larger and larger and people are using it more frivolously, but I think this is to our detriment. I mean, let's change the phrasing of that sentence. Every institution in America is born from the idea that white people are superior to all other races. Does that not seem a little far-fetched to you, to put it mildly? I mean, really? Every institution? Medical, financial, firefighters, the arts? And even if you want to claim that certain institutions like medical institutions were built, studied, and practiced primarily on white people, you want to claim that this is due to white supremacy instead of, the fact that white people were at the time a much larger majority of the population? I'm sorry, but I don't buy it, and quite frankly, I'm not sure why one would even want to buy it. Speaking of buying, let's quickly move on to the other claim, that every institution in America is born from the blood of capitalism, and that this is a disease. Now, I've briefly discussed my left-leaning political views before. I am not one who is going to claim that capitalism is the be-all, end-all, perfect example of a utopian society. Capitalism, left unchecked, is a breeding ground for people who prioritize profits over all else, including human welfare. You can see this in company owners who give their workers the barest minimum of pay and benefits, and yet often make lofty demands of them, or threats if those demands are not carried out. You can see it in the American healthcare system, where the whole process is so mired in additional third parties and bureaucracy that prices have skyrocketed to cartoonish proportions, and even when people have some form of insurance, they usually have to pay thousands of dollars for care. If you have to decide between going bankrupt or dying, I maintain that that is a corrupt and evil system that causes tremendous harm and mental strain on American people. However, all this being said, we have many examples where capitalism can lead to tremendous success, wealth, innovation, and prosperity. Countries with some form of capitalism, i.e. with varying inclusions of socialized programs like healthcare, are generally those where people are the most well off, and where there is greater equity in terms of access to resources, careers, education, etc. Again, by no means is this always the case, and there are obviously still examples, even significant examples, of wealth disparity and lack of upward mobility for people. But compare this to countries that are purely socialist or even communist, and no, despite what some people may claim, these are not the same thing, and you can see the differences in the overall well-being of the people. I am not saying that capitalism is perfect and untouchable and that we should close the books on ever hoping for or trying to find a better system of managing society. Not at all. But acting like capitalism is any more diseased or has brought upon its people more harms than many of the current alternatives is just misinformed and absurd, and it is easy to demonstrate the converse. It's a particularly laughable claim coming from someone with a PhD who is president of a psychological association. Someone who, I would imagine, is profiting quite handily in a capitalist society themselves. Anyway, this video is getting to be rather on the long side now, and like I said, this is only the first paragraph of this article. I don't know if I will return to the rest of it. Honestly, there are a few other topics that are a little bit more pressing in my mind, so I think I'm just going to move on to those. But I did want to share my frustrations with you all, and at least offer a small critique here, just because it was something that came up unexpectedly this month and really chafed my carrot. Before I end this video, I just wanted to extend a brief thank you to all of my new and continued patrons. Thanks to you, I was able to afford a new mic upgrade, as my poor old Snowball finally bit the dust. I also just briefly wanted to mention as well, even though I have lost a few patrons quite understandably over the last few months, I have not lowered my donation to the Canadian Centre for Men and Families to match my new income. Honestly, once I reach a certain threshold for donating to the men's services, I feel bad dialing it back in response to lost patrons. So I just want those of you who are still with me to know now that even more of your donations are now going to other men in need. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next one.